So this is really our first annual conference on addiction and attachment, and we really want to be doing this every year. Mark Green and I really started this, and we really see this as an important contribution to the addiction field. The programs as we go forward will typically look like this, where we'll have some speakers giving sort of a sample of ideas on how to deal with attachment and addiction. And we have some goals for this conference, and they're all entwined. I mean, one is really to kind of give these samples. It's like you're in the cheese department at Whole Foods and you try a little cube, and you may like that cube, and you may want to say that cube is one I want to follow. I want to get that big piece of cheese and learn more about it. So you're going to follow one of these speakers, look them up, and go to their trainings and those sort of things. Or you may just, get attracted to cheese in general, and you look at this whole process of how we think about addiction and attachment, and you begin to explore it. Because these are just samples. There's lots of thinking out there, and we'll be bringing people in the years to come. So we want to talk about that interaction. We're also going to talk about the relationship between psychotherapeutic approaches and addiction, because when we start talking about attachment issues and addiction, we're usually talking about psychotherapeutic approaches. And when we're talking about psychotherapeutic approaches, we're also often talking about harm reduction and a harm reduction approach, which is sort of a foundation to good psychotherapeutic work. We're really seeing the client as an autonomous actor, that we're helping make decisions along the way through a collaborative relationship. And that's basically kind of what we mean by our harm reduction approach. And then there's me, and I didn't want to put a picture of myself up there, so I put up Saul Berenson from Homeland. I'm trained as a sociologist and a psychotherapist, as Laurie said, and I'm going to try today to give a bit of a container, as Dr. Bevington would put it, a bit of a container around this conference. And that container, though, is going to have a little feel from my perspective, which is how do we think about attachment and addiction, both in a sociological sense and also how it plays in systems of care, and also what an attachment approach means about ourselves. And what I'm going to talk about is mostly it means a real view of the self as a social being. I'm just about the worst title writer there is, and this is the worst title I've ever come up with for any conference or paper or book or anything like that. And it's a spark of opportunity and attachment theories on addiction and the risk of just another reductionism. I don't know if you can figure out what I mean by all that. Synthesizing emerging theories on the self and how they draw us to a social model. That's the kind of title that if I were at a conference, I would avoid the talk. But if I walk through it, we might get kind of a frame for where I'm going to go with this. So us sociologists, we don't really believe that ideas exist independently of a social context. We think that they are socially contingent, is the way we would put it. They're not like facts like the sky is blue. They have some room around them that is about their social context. And often that social context has issues of power in it. Professional power, professions trying to kind of gain a hold in the world through a new idea. Economic power, people trying to make money off of a new idea. And political power, people controlling people through a new idea. And so we're always looking at that. But we also believe that in every idea there's the potential, not every idea, but most ideas there's potential for resistance. Potential to open up new ways of thinking. To open us up to exciting ways in which we're actually helping liberate people. So we're always looking at those two things when we look at ideas. And I'm going to look at the idea of attachment and addiction that way a little bit today. For me, the spark, the opportunity is this idea that we're social beings. Is this idea that when we're treating a person who's suffering from attachment issues or suffering from some sort of addictive behavior, that we're treating somebody who's in the world, not outside of it. And that treating and thinking about our systems of care through a lens that sees the social as important as the psyche, attachment theory brings us there. It brings us there because of this. Basically, attachment is saying that parents are raising their children to become social beings, to cooperate and collaborate. That attachment theory is based on evolutionary theory, and it's saying that us human beings are basically the most social animals there are, and that the pain that comes to people with attachment issues is the pain between self and other. It's not sunk deep inside of them as like some sort of pathology that's inside of them. It's a pathology that happens at the moment that they try to make contact with others, and their suffering is at those moments. So it brings us to looking at that interaction between self and other. That's the spark. The danger is that as we develop these psychological theories for addiction, we become what's called reductionistic. Most of you probably know what this term means, but it's very similar to a typical human quality, which is called attribution error, which is where we see something happening around us, and the first thing we think about is something's wrong with the person. It's a trait, not a state. And so we're always thinking what's wrong with the person, not what's happening to the person. And psychology has a long history of reductionism. And some of that's good because we have to kind of contain our therapies and offices and we have to think about what's happening to the individual. And some of it's dangerous because we begin to neglect to see what's happening around the person in society, in their town, in their family, moments of oppression, moments of racism, moments of classism, all these sorts of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the reductionism at the end, but I'm mostly going to talk about this opportunity. And these are the three kind of rock stars right now in the area of different ways of thinking about addiction. Do you guys mostly know who these guys are? Or? Good, because about 20 years ago I called my wife from Framingham. I'd gone to this bookstore and I was really excited about the bookstore. And it had this coffee shop and I thought it was kind of an amazing contribution to Framingham. And she asked me, what is this place? And I said, well, it's got this great name. It's called Borders. So I have this tendency to not know what's known and what's not known in the world. So this is Gabor Mate, Bruce Alexander, and Carl Hart. I'm going to start with Mate. And Mate is going to bring us to some of the kind of the basic understandings about attachment and addiction. And when I talk about him, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent in as far as the research done on it. It's his basic ideas, but there's a lot of research that sort of cover the things he talks about. And Mate's famous quote is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And that's sort of a simple quote, it's poetic, but it means a lot. It means that what we should be doing with our clients is really looking at the source of what's causing them to use. That it's not simply that they're chemically hooked to something that they smoked once or twice and now they're hooked to it. It's that they're trying to solve some sort of pain. And for him, that pain is attachment pain. It's from attachment trauma, it's from bad attachments in childhood, and it's from the social pain that comes with our attachments in our daily life. And he bases a lot of this on this thing called the ACE study. Do people know about that? Good. It's actually bad. You should know about it. It's adverse childhood event research, and it's really talking about all the ways in which bad attachments, bad events for children end up with basically attacking their entire system. That when you have these poor events in childhood, you end up dying younger. It ends up having massive biological effects on you, behavioral effects, social effects, economic effects. And he's saying that addiction is one of those effects. That basically when you're working with someone who has an addiction issue, you're probably working with someone who has an attachment issue. And Mark and I actually had a little bit of an argument with him when he came and spoke to us because he's a little reductionistic about this. He sees every single person as traumatized who's using, right? He says some interesting things though. Addiction may not be a natural state, but the brain regions which its powers arise are central to our survival. And what he means is that the very thing that happens when we attach is the very thing that use of substances affects. So when we're not attached, we go into a state of stress. And most of that pyramid, by the way, the biological effects of attachment is about stress. We go into this stress and cortisol's released, and we're in this stress mode. And when you're in a stress mode, your body's telling you to do something, and you can solve that through addictive behavior and through drugs and alcohol. And they really do that. Attachment affects endorphins, attachment affects the dopamine system, and so do drugs and alcohol. These are regions of the brain affected. Purple is where addictive behavior affects, and purple is where attachment affects. And you'll notice there's only a couple little blue places there, and those are actually attachment, not addiction. So everything that is affected when you're not attached is affected through addictive behavior and through substance abuse. And so he says there's these three factors. There's one, our susceptibility. We're susceptible because we're these social animals. And when we don't connect, we go into a mode of stress. Why? Because basically our evolution has brought us to a place that we depend on one another, that we are collaborative animals, and that when we're not with the group, and when we feel outside the group, we go into this stress mode. And so we're susceptible. And then he says, and then the second thing is some sort of addictive substance or behavior, and then the third is stress. That all these three things come together, and a person ends up creating the habit of use. So these are apes, I guess, and they're preening. And apes preen 10% of each day, they're preening. Turns out that they're doing a little bit of pulling bugs off each other and cleaning each other. But what they're actually doing is working on stress, because what they're doing is they're sharing oxytocin. And oxytocin is called the hug hormone or the love hormone. It's produced when women have babies and when they breastfeed. It's produced during sex, produced more during sex when it's a romantic couple than when it's strangers. It's produced when you hug, and it calms us down. And when we're not calmed down, when we're not getting that oxytocin, stress goes up. These are prairie voles. Prairie voles are really a story about no good deed goes unpunished. These are the most coupled mammal, the most monogamous mammal in the animal kingdom. And because they're the most monogamous mammal in the animal kingdom, they get studied all the time and pulled into labs. If you decrease the dopamine in these animals, they stop pairing. If you increase it, they start pairing. If you decrease the endorphins in their system, they stop pairing. If you increase it, they start pairing. They begin to produce cortisol when they're detached from each other, just like when somebody's detached from their drug of choice. They produce cortisol. They go into a stress mode, and when you replace it, the signs of that stress, which looks like grief for these animals, actually dissipates a bit. If you give people oxytocin, they trust each other more. So they're more willing to lend money. There's a thing called the open envelope experiment where you basically put something sort of confidential about yourself, and the people that take oxytocin don't necessarily seal that envelope, and they're more willing to be closer to people. So it's really a trust hormone. It might also be a stupid hormone because some of these things you shouldn't be necessarily doing. Female rats, they're kind of famous for not being kind to young rats. They even eat their young. But female mothers have a surge of dopamine, and it's that dopamine that makes them actually extremely maternal. They end up really protecting their young and risking their lives to protect their young. They'll run across a grate, electrical grate, and take shock to get to their young and protect them. If you lower that, they end up not engaging with their young. Some animals, they start crying when they're released, when they're separated from their mothers, guinea pigs, dogs, other animals. And you can lower that crying by raising the endorphins in their system. It's like a volume control, and you can raise their crying by lowering the endorphins. So all of these chemicals are really the chemicals of attachment. They're central to our connection. And all these chemicals are like, for mate, fill something for us. So this is like homeostasis with all these chemicals when we're connected, when we feel connected to others. And when we don't have that, we're in this place of pain, and we're in this place of stress. And pain and stress, by the way, are these two things in our brains that are telling us we have to do something. You have to take care of this. You're in a dangerous place. And without alternatives, we end up filling it with things that raise our dopamine, raise our endorphins, sometimes lower our cortisol, and sometimes raise the oxytocin. So I'm going to show you some animals that clearly are on some sort of drug.
Oh, Zoe.
Now, for those of you that might have watched this and felt this kind of surge of warm feeling when you watch this, there's research on that too. People who have owned dogs, when they see dogs, their oxytocin goes up. Strangely enough, people that own cats and have owned cats, their oxytocin doesn't go up when they see a cat. That gives you sort of a picture of the world of Gabor Mate. He does talk about the social element of the self, but he is interested really centrally in sort of these traumas that happen in childhood and how they affect the whole system and why that can lead towards addictive behavior. And there's Bruce Alexander. How many people know about Rat Park? Basically, they did these studies on rats, and basically they were proving that opiates, that opium is this massive chemical hook, that these rats would get on this chemical and they would basically drink opiate-laced water until they died. Each rat in this experiment died. Well, rats are like these intensely social animals. And Alexander asked, well, what would happen if you put them with a bunch of other rats and you created a rat park? I'm not sure what they do in the rat park. They have picnics, I don't know, or 4th of July parties, I don't know. But they have this rat park. And all of a sudden, some of the rats would take the opiate. None of the rats died. And his example for this, or what he was trying to draw from this, is that there's alternatives that are lacking in our environment for us to fill these needs in our brain. And that's why his book's called The Globalization of Addiction. He's interested in the idea that addiction is really this social problem that has to do with what a sociologist would call estrangement or anomie or alienation. That we live in these communities where we're no longer connected. And so we're not getting the right things to kind of keep our stress down and to keep our brains activated in the right kind of way. His work influences and is influenced by this really remarkable thinker by the name of Carl Hart. So Carl Hart grew up in very impoverished neighborhoods of Miami, Florida. And he has a very important point to make, which is that these neighborhoods were doing really poorly before the crack epidemic. And that the idea that the crack epidemic actually created these neighborhoods is a myth. And the problem was that people had no alternatives for their despair in these neighborhoods, and crack offered them that alternative. The myth is a very convenient myth, right, for policy people, for politicians. It blames the lack of opportunity on a substance instead of on our policies, on systems of oppression and racism. But Hart did something really, really interesting. He took this to the granular level. And so he did research, I think he still does research, on people who are addicted to crack cocaine. They go into a lab, and somehow Carl Hart was able to get through the research groups at Columbia University and was able to get crack cocaine from the federal government to give to these people. And they smoke one hit of crack cocaine, and then he offers them $5 to not smoke the next one. Now, $5 doesn't mean much to somebody, but they can collect up to $50 if they keep doing this. There's 10 chances over a long period of time. And a good amount of people choose the $5, meaning that when they're given this other opportunity, they actually choose it. Now, if we believe in this sort of like powerful chemical hook idea, there'd be no way they could choose that, right? So when we think about addiction, we're thinking about both an addictive substance and a lack of opportunity. They're the two things are going on at the same time. A lack to solve some of these things and the addictive substance. So we've got this idea, this question, why the pain? And we've got this idea from Hart and from Alexander and a bit from Mate that the pain isn't just located in attachment issues, it's located in social experience. So I'm going to sort of talk about how it is. Where's the pain? Supposedly there were going to be 120 people in this room, and there aren't. 150 people is what's called the Dunbar's number. And Dunbar is an anthropologist who is interested in this one number, 148, 150. And Dunbar's number, actually Gore-Tex company, they make their parking lots only 150 parking spaces because of the Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is the amount of people that you can have a familiar relationship with. You can remember in your head, and that could be the clerk at Trader Joe's. I don't think they call them clerks there, they probably have some fancy name, but the clerk at Trader Joe's, it's your family, that's your Dunbar's number. And once you get past that Dunbar number, you're dealing kind of with strangers, and you need rules and regulations and all those sorts of things, and norms and culture and all that to get along. Now Dunbar's not just interested in that number, he's interested in how that number is reflected in our brains. Our neocortex is directly related to the amount of people we have in our Dunbar's number. Now, our neocortex is also the thing that makes us most human. It is the element that basically was built for our survival as collaborative beings. It's where language, where all the things we have to do to mentalize another's experience, all this stuff is happening in the neocortex. The chimpanzee's Dunbar's number is about 36. They can only deal with 36 other chimpanzees and not the person at Trader Joe's, but they're a much smaller neocortex. So the thing that makes us most human is this thing that we've developed to be able to act and behave collaboratively. And what happens when we're outside the group, when we're not part of the group?
Okay, that I'm part of an experiment and this is supposed to teach me something, but really how I feel is pissed off.
I felt a little lost because we had all gone into this on the same level. And And here they were developing their own thing, and I was just left aside.
I thought, okay, this is a joke, or they've got something against me.
Okay, so both these women clearly went through some sort of experiment that was very, very upsetting for them. And during that experiment, they were plugged into an fMRI machine. And the part of their brain that responds to pain was all lit up. So this has to be something pretty dramatic that they went through, right? I mean, the same amount of redness there that happens on this guy John on there when he's in actual physical pain is lit up in their brains. And they're very upset from this experiment. So you got to think this is a really significantly painful experience and experiment. Well, here's the experiment. This is called cyberball. Basically, this is the subject, and they throw this little red ball to two people they think are other subjects, but they aren't. They're part of a computer program. And those two other subjects start throwing the ball back to each other. That's it. That causes this massive, painful event for people. And people do cyberball, and they're really upset afterwards. And it is what social psychologists carry around in their toolbox if they want to induce ostracism. They basically know this is the way you induce the experience of ostracism. Now, Kipling Williams, the guy that invented this, he now tells people, yeah, you're playing a computer. There's no other subjects. They do this thing, still lights up the same amount. So there's something even kind of pre-conscious to us that's ready to be excluded and is terrified at the point of exclusion, right? So Mate said we have the susceptible organism. We're susceptible, right? We can kind of agree that the brain is set for connecting, and that when we're not connecting, we're susceptible to try to find something quickly because we're in this stress place, in this painful place. We're trying to find something quickly to replace what's missing from attachment. And we have addictive potential. We have addictive behaviors and drugs that have addiction potential to them. And then he talks about stress. And I want to talk about stress a little bit too. Can we mark off stress on this list? So one thing is cyberball. Being excluded is stressful, but so is loneliness and isolation, so is a lack of social support, and so is a lack of purpose. And these things affect us whether we've had bad attachment relationships in our youth or not. These are social psychological or sociological phenomena on the brain that don't have to do with whether we've been injured in our attachments. There's a really remarkable book called Loneliness by a very important neuropsychologist from University of Chicago, by the name of John Cacioppo. Basically, when you're alone and you're isolated, you have a decrease in oxytocin, your cortisol skyrockets, your arteries, because of some of these things, begin to harden, you get high blood pressure, poor sleep, and it has a genetic effect on your immune system. And that's likely why isolation actually ties with smoking and cholesterol for heart disease. And you end up with these psychological problems. You end up with problems with learning and memory. And you begin to get actually kind of paranoid. You're so worried about your contact with others and what could happen in those contacts that you begin to not really mentalize their experiences, to think about what's happening with them. And you begin to distort their behavior. Social support. Social support's different than someone being lonely. Not having social support means not having a group that you depend on, that you think about as your supports around you, this sort of intimate group. And when people don't have social support, their oxytocin drops, their immunity gets affected, they begin to see threats in front of them as more dangerous than they are, they begin to see challenges as more challenging than they are, and they're, again, unable to perceive the experiences of others accurately. That might be why social support is a strong indicator for recovery from addiction, that people that have a greater net of social support around them recover more quickly and are less likely to relapse. Purposelessness. When you don't have purpose, your stress goes up. You have a decrease in grit, the ability to move on despite difficult odds. You have a decrease in the ability to handle uncontrollable situations. Your motivation begins to plummet. You have a loss of efficiency in finishing tasks. I know a little bit about this. When I wake up on a Sunday and I don't have anything planned, I'm less likely to get done with household chores than I am if my day's busy and full, right? There's all sorts of start to crumble. And you're more likely to engage in destructive behavior. This might be why therapeutic workplaces are now really showing to have as good or better effect than IOPs or partial hospitalizations on addictive behavior. So I think we can mark off stress, right? And maybe we could even give a name to this, adverse adult experience. It's more a state than a trait, right? A child who's had these adverse experiences, it has a fundamental effect on their being that lasts, and you need help for in some way because it lasts within your system. This, when you get purpose, it sort of goes away. But there are these adverse experiences in our lives that affect the same parts of the brain and the same parts of us that these adverse childhood experiences have. It's remarkably similar. It decreases our lifespan. They affect our health. They affect our behavior. And they affect the very thing that we talk about when we talk about attachment disorders, which is the inability to mentalize the intents and the experiences of others. This is the part of the Y for YMCA. And it also comes from Catholicism, and it comes from Egyptian culture, this mind, body, spirit. Well, here's what AA did to it. Sounds like what I was just talking about, right? Unity, connectedness, service, purpose. They had something right when they were thinking about that. Now, considering this idea of adverse adult experiences, how are we doing in this field? Are we being sensitive to the potential for these experiences? Well, we tend to coerce people into treatment, especially teenagers. That is potentially an adverse adult experience. We tend to suggest treatment away from your community. That can lead to an adverse adult experience. We tend to focus on readiness. We tell people, you're not really ready to go back to work until you have a good amount of sobriety under your belt. You're not able to have a romantic relationship until you have a good amount of sobriety under your belt. You're basically telling them that the medicine for addiction they need to wait for because they're not ready. And we focus solely on sobriety. We're asking a person who's in significant despair, stress, pain, to give up something that's sort of solving that. We're asking them really to step into hell. This thing and step into this moment of detachment and disconnection. So how are we doing? Not well, actually. Now, I just want to make a caveat here because there's friends of mine in the audience who run programs that do these sorts of things. Many of these programs are good and they're needed. I'm just trying to give a different point of view about some of these things. Definitely people should be forced on some level when they're at the point of killing themselves with the drug, right? There's all kinds of ways in which harm reduction means doing the right thing because someone's about to die, right? But the element that I'm talking about is kind of missing in our world. So are there places where you can get this kind of care that is sensitive to this adult attachment event and to childhood attachment events? And I obviously think there are. That's why we're having this conference, right? That's the spark. That when you begin to think in a harm reduction, psychotherapeutically based approach, you're thinking in a way about the connection between you and the client, that this is a very important attachment relationship. It's a terminal one, but it's a very important attachment relationship. You're treating the person typically in the community. And like all psychotherapy, part of the psychotherapy is the work the client's doing in the community. And you're there for them to come back to and reflect on their events. And so you're taking a harm reduction approach when you're doing this. You're not kicking people out for use, because that's destroying the attachment. You're working with them whether they're using or not. Now, I had a fifth reason for this conference that I didn't mention before. And I'm going to sort of end with the description of that fifth reason. And this really does require my sociological brain to start working. And this fifth reason has some criticism to it about how things are going in the addiction field. And again, I have friends here who I hope don't feel too criticized, because I know that the programs they run have very, very good clinicians. I've visited these programs and they do very, very good work. And so I refer people to them, and I sure hope they keep referring to us. But there are elements of this new movement in the addiction field that poses that risk I've been talking about, I talked about earlier. That's number 5 in our reasons for the conference, and I'm going to finish with that. So we're part of this trend. There's this movement that began about 20 years ago, or 15, 20 years ago, where we began to think a little bit more about whether psychotherapeutic values might have some influence and some say in the care for addiction. And there was a period where this was sort of thought of as blasphemy, where the two things couldn't mix because people were, their brains were hijacked. There was no good in doing anything reflective with them. And also because there was a concern that we would activate them in our therapy and they'd go out and they'd use more. But these things are slowly coming together, and partly because of this book, this remarkable book that somehow got away with saying things that were the opposite of what the addiction field was doing without controversy. They did it in such a Rogerian kind way that nobody got that they were saying the opposite. The disease model says a person with disease should seek professional treatment. The MI people say, well, people actually have a natural tendency to change, and most people actually recover on their own, or they go to moderation. So why would we always think they need this kind of treatment? And we respect each individual, like psychotherapists do, as autonomous beings that are making decisions. It's very different than that model. The disease model says if they don't do the logical thing and seek treatment, it's because their brain is hijacked and they are in denial. And the motivational interview, and people said, well, actually, treatment doesn't work that great. So you're trying to kind of force people into things that may not work. And plus, it's not really denial, it's ambivalence. They're kind of weighing these things. Again, that's a psychotherapeutic value, this idea that people are always weighing things, and you're there to build a collaborative relationship with them. Since their brains are hijacked, they need others to forcefully save them, getting them to see that disease. Well, no, a therapist's job is to build a strong relationship with their client, and hopefully this client will make the right decisions. Very, very different, and it's part of this slow change to a new way of thinking about addiction. And so we're on this road where these two things are getting closer together, and along that road, we have this book, right? And we have this event. Really important moment in the care of people with behavioral issues was the Parity Act, which really began the idea that people should be treated the same way as physical issues with their insurance and with Medicare and Medicaid. It's again, when you think about everything that a sociologist looks at as positive and also its potential for power, this is one of those, a very positive moment. But soon after that came this. You guys see this guy on TV? First of all, I don't know why he couldn't get out of his scrubs. I mean, it's a goddamn commercial. He should be dressed differently. Basically, large investment firms began to realize, and this is where I hope I don't lose any friends here today, large investment firms began to realize that there was money to be made in behavioral treatment. And this is a quote from an investors meeting. The opioid epidemic represents a favorable industry tailwind. Again, you have to trust me that I have an ambivalent view of the world, that the medical model has all these good qualities and all these negative qualities, but the medical model is definitely an excellent way to talk people into treatment. It's definitely an excellent sales pitch. The reason why you don't want to come to our program is because of your denial. And you're actually kind of being irresponsible. People who have a disease need to get help, and you're doing something wrong by not getting help. Well, my parents think that I maybe don't need treatment. They want to try some other things. Your parents are enablers. It has this quality of really pulling a person in. So what do we do with this sales pitch as we move forward? What do places do with this sales pitch if they're trying to kind of control the narrative that's going on now that psychotherapeutic elements are in our way of thinking? Well, they've done an ingenious thing. Co-occurring, when I was being trained, meant somebody, or dual diagnosis meant somebody who has a significant psychiatric issue who is using substances to calm their pain. Dual diagnosis and co-occurring is now used in these large companies to describe everybody. It's a way of merging these two ways of thinking and to keep the sales pitch going. Because now what you're saying to somebody is, not only do you have an addiction, but you're broken inside because of your trauma, because of your attachment issues. And you're doubly not being responsible seeking treatment. And by the way, we can open up our client base larger because now we're dealing with mental health issues. So to show you a little bit about this in a more granular way, I went undercover. And I went undercover as a timid 55-year-old would go undercover, so it's not anything too fancy. There's a site out there, and I'm not going to name it, but there's a site out there that basically does not mention anything about programs or advertise for programs. And this site looks like a clearinghouse for people with dual diagnosis issues, a way to kind of go and learn about dual diagnosis and what it means. And so I went on this site, and I went as this guy named Rob, because I'm very inventive about changing Ross to Rob. And I'm a guy who lost his job. Someone told him he might have dual diagnosis, and so he's hit the chat button to get more information. That's all he wants. He wants to know more about this thing called dual diagnosis. She's answering the earlier question, not in order. I'm trying my hardest to get her to define dual diagnosis. This next response is baffling. One more. She's getting a little frustrated with me. So here we go, most people. So here we go. And most people are, but this becomes part of the sales, right? This is my favorite. Look at this. one of the main purposes for these conferences, in my mind, and why did we want to keep these going annually, is that we want clinicians to own this narrative. And we want good clinicians to own this narrative. Our clients are not commodities. And they're not, their suffering is not a tailwind of financial prosperity. We're all suffering from attachment issues. None of us, anybody that goes unscathed from attachment issues is insane, right? We're all dealing constantly with these attachment issues and attachment events. And there are brothers and sisters that are at the margins, that are in pain. And our job as therapists is to kind of bring them home, right? And to bring them home in a collaborative way. So thank you.